You can't even imagine that in this world there exists a plant that was placed in the tombs of the pharaohs on their way to the afterlife. A plant that people ate thousands of years ago, long before the advent of agriculture. It grows without fertilizers, survives drought, and is much more beneficial than many modern crops. But today, agricultural authorities around the world officially call it one of the most dangerous weeds on the planet. Farmers are taught to kill it with chemicals, and chemical companies make millions selling herbicides against it. But the question is, why did a plant that has fed civilizations for thousands of years suddenly become an enemy of agriculture? Today, we'll go back 6,000 years to uncover the story of a superfood that was once considered a common weed. In the early 20th century, archaeologists excavating Egyptian tombs made a discovery that completely changed our understanding of ancient nutrition. Archaeologists expected to see gold, amulets, and jewelry there, but they found something unexpected. It turned out that small dried tubers lay next to the bodies of the great pharaohs. At first they were mistaken for random food, but analysis showed something completely different. The tubers were carefully selected, specially dried, and carefully placed next to the body. But the most unexpected discovery was made by archaeologists later, when they began to examine not only the objects in the tombs, but also the mummies themselves. Analysis showed that the same plants were found in the stomachs of some of them, meaning that the pharaohs and noble Egyptians ate them literally before their death. And all this was not just for nothing, because the tubers were not just a plant, but a symbol of eternal life and divine nutrition. The ancient Egyptians placed them in tombs as sacred offerings and believed that they nourished the Ka and Ba, gave strength for the journey through the Duat, helped one pass the judgment of Osiris, and be reborn in the fields of Yalu. This was not just food for one day, but a guarantee of immortality and a reserve of energy that did not spoil for centuries and did not require animal sacrifices or complex rituals. The tubers were considered sacred, and in themselves contained the power of the Nile, fertility, and the eternal cycle of rebirth. The walls of the tomb of Vizier Rechmir, one of the high-ranking officials of the New Kingdom, even depict the process of preparing food from them. Workers pounded them in large mortars, mixed them with honey, and formed small sweet cones while a scribe stood nearby, carefully counting the harvest. Such sweets were considered ritual offerings and were often presented to the gods, especially during festivals dedicated to Amun. References to the tubers also appear in ancient medical texts such as the Eber's Papyrus, where they were used in medicinal and aromatic mixtures. All this shows that for the ancient Egyptians they were not just a random plant, but a familiar product, part of cuisine, medicine, and religious rituals. And that is why it is especially surprising that today the same plant in many countries is considered a common weed that farmers are trying to eradicate. But the mystery of this plant begins much earlier, long before the appearance of the Egyptian pyramids and the first civilizations. In the archaeological site of Wadi Kubaniya on the west bank of the Nile, just 20 kilometers from Aswan, researchers discovered the charred remains of the same plants. A careful analysis revealed a striking date, approximately 16,000 years ago. This meant that people were eating these tubers 8,000 years before the advent of agriculture. In those distant times, humanity did not build cities, did not grow fields, and did not breed domestic animals. People lived in small bands of hunters and gatherers, roaming along rivers and desert plains and surviving thanks to the wild nature. And it was then that the small underground tubers became one of the most valuable food sources, as they could easily be found in the soft soil near water. They were sweet, nutritious, and most importantly, they could be stored for a very long time. And for people of the Ice Age, this was a real treasure because such a supply of food did not require either hunting or complex tools. Some researchers believe that such plants may have played an important role in the survival of early humans because they provided a stable source of carbohydrates during times when hunting might be unsuccessful. Over time, as the climate began to change and people gradually transitioned from a nomadic life to a sedentary one, tubers did not disappear from the diet. On the contrary, they began to be used purposefully, and for about 5,000 years, BC, this plant was actively cultivated on the banks of the Nile. Along with wheat and barley, Tubers became part of early Egyptian agriculture and provided people with nutritious food in the hot and dry climate. The Egyptians called this plant Habel Aziz, which can be translated as precious tuber. Of course, over time, knowledge about tubers spread far beyond the borders of Egypt. Ancient Greek authors wrote about tubers. They were known in the Roman Empire, and traders transported the tubers throughout the Mediterranean. Even the ancient Greek botanist Theophrastus wrote about how to boil tiger nut in beer to produce a nutritious drink. The strangest thing is that today most people don't even know about this plant, although for thousands of years it has remained part of the diet of people on different continents. The small, sweet tubers that once fed Ice Age humans, adorned the tombs of pharaohs, and were part of ancient cuisine now simply sit in the shadows. Today, this plant is known by many names. In Spain it is called Chufa. In some African countries it is called tadwe, and in the English-speaking world it is most often known by the name tiger nuts due to the characteristic stripes on the surface of the tubers. However, in fact, it is not a nut at all, but a member of the sedge family, the same family that contains the ancient papyrus from which the Egyptians made the first sheets of writing. This plant is easily recognized by its triangular stems and narrow, long leaves that resemble grass. However, its true value is hidden underground, because it is there that a whole network of small tubers is formed, sometimes up to several dozen on a single plant. Each one is about the size of a pea, dense and dark on the outside, light and sweet on the inside, and their flavor is often described as a cross between almond, coconut, and hazelnut. The ancient Egyptians used these tubers in a variety of ways, eating them raw, roasting them over coals, boiling them with beer, or grinding them into a paste and mixing them with honey to create sweet dishes. Tiger nut was not only used as a food, as ancient Egyptian medical texts mention mixtures based on it, when they were used to treat inflammations of the oral cavity, as well as to prepare aromatic incense with which to fumigate houses and temples. Over time, the plant spread far beyond Egypt, and after the Arab conquests it found itself in North Africa, Sicily, and the Iberian Peninsula. It took root particularly well in the Valencia region, where they began to make a drink from it that is today known as horchata de Chufa, and is a true symbol of summer. The history of horchata goes back to the 18th century, when King Jaime I conquered Valencia and was served a drink made from tiger nuts. Legend has it that he exclaimed, "This isn't milk, this is pure gold, my beauty." This is where the name horchata comes from, which translates as beauty. Today, in Valencia, up to 8,000 tons of tiger nuts are grown annually specifically for horchata and then used to make the drink. The tubers are soaked for a day, chopped, the milk is squeezed out, sugar is added, sometimes cinnamon or lemon, and served ice cold in hot weather. It's not just a drink, but a tradition, part of fiestas, family gatherings, and street stalls throughout Valencia. But the main reason why Chufa was valued for thousands of years was not only its taste, because its tubers had a rare property. They stored perfectly. After harvesting, they were simply air-dried, and in this form they could be stored for years without refrigeration or any special conditions. If necessary, the tubers could simply be soaked in water for several hours, and they would again become soft and edible. Moreover, many of them remained viable and could germinate even after a long time. Thanks to this feature, Chufa was not just a food product, but actually served as a reliable food supply. The crop could be harvested in the fall, dried, and used for many months, and this is why this humble plant has remained a part of human history for thousands of years. Tiger nut is truly an amazingly nutritious plant, as its tubers contain 10% protein. However, unlike most other grains, they also contain all the essential amino acids. But what's especially surprising is the fat content, because depending on the variety and growing conditions, the tubers can contain between 22 and 45% oil. A small tuber about the size of a chickpea, and inside it lies a real treasure such as oleic acid, which is also found in olive oil, which is what makes it so valuable. Thanks to this composition, in some regions of Africa, vegetable oil was even pressed from tiger nut, and modern researchers consider it a potential crop for biodiesel production. However, it's not just fats and protein that make it special. The carbohydrates in the tubers are represented by so-called resistant starch. This is a special type of starch that does not cause sharp spikes in blood sugar and at the same time serves as food for beneficial gut bacteria. In simple terms, it works as a natural prebiotic. At the same time, tiger nut contains almost twice as much starch as potatoes, but has a significantly lower glycemic index and the energy is released from it gradually. The tubers are also incredibly rich in fiber, with content that can be nearly 4 times higher than some traditional sources of dietary fiber. In addition, Chufa contains calcium, magnesium, iron, potassium, and vitamin E, which is why many researchers today call Chufa one of the oldest superfoods in human history. Another important benefit of tiger nut is that it does not contain gluten, milk proteins, or any other allergens, making it suitable for people with celiac disease, gluten intolerance, and many food allergies. For this reason, it is increasingly being used as a safe alternative for vegetarians and those looking for more natural products. The tubers can be ground into flour and used in gluten-free baking. They are used to make bread, cookies, pasta, and even energy bars. And if you soak the tubers and grind them with water, you get a creamy drink known as tiger milk. In Valencia, this drink has been consumed for centuries and has a mild, nutty coconut flavor, making it perfect for coffee, smoothies, or porridge. The tubers can also be toasted in a dry frying pan or baked in the oven, which turns them into a crispy, aromatic snack reminiscent of roasted almonds or coconut chips, but without the additives and unnecessary processing. And when eaten raw after soaking, they become soft, juicy, and slightly sweet, with a pleasant, nutty flavor, somewhat reminiscent of young almonds or fresh coconut. And now we come to the most important question, which is rarely answered openly. If these tiny tubers have nourished people for thousands of years, if they survive drought, grow with virtually no fertilizer, and are nutritionally as good as many modern crops, why aren't they occupying vast fields around the world today? Why are millions of hectares of land sown with wheat, corn, and soybeans, while tiger nut remains a virtually unknown plant? The answer isn't as obvious as it seems. The plant we call tiger nut has a wild relative, the yellow sedge. Botanically, they are the same species of plant, known by the Latin name Cyperus, esculentus. In nature, it spreads easily and has an amazing ability to survive, so in modern agronomy it began to be considered not as a food plant, but as a weed. Today, yellow sedge is listed as one of the most problematic agricultural weeds in many countries around the world, and the reason for this lies in the plant's unique survival system. Underground, it forms a branched network of rhizomes that can extend several meters around the mother plant. At the ends of these rhizomes, small tubers form, the same sweet tiger nuts that people ate thousands of years ago. One plant can produce up to 200 tubers per season, and they can lie dormant in the soil for years, surviving cold, drought, and even chemical treatment. However, if at least part of it remains in the ground, after a while the field will become covered with sedge again. This is why farmers in many countries consider it a real nightmare, because once it appears, it is almost impossible to get rid of it. By the late 20th century, the problem had become so severe that the U.S. Department of Agriculture issued a special technical bulletin devoted exclusively to yellow sedge and its control methods. The document detailed the spread and methods of destruction, as it began to seriously interfere with the cultivation of corn, soybeans, and other crops. From that moment on, the plant that was once considered food for ancient civilizations was officially relegated to the category of weed. Soon, a real agronomic war began. Scientists and chemical companies began to develop substances that could stop the growth of sedge. Special herbicides targeting this plant appeared, including compounds such as glyphosate, bentazone, halosulfuron, and sulfentrazone. But even with the use of modern chemistry, the fight turned out to be difficult, and many scientific studies directly state that a single treatment rarely gives a complete result. Therefore, to reduce the plant population in a field, agronomists are often forced to carry out repeated treatments over several years. The reason again lies in those very underground tubers, because as long as they remain in the soil, the plant is able to return again and again. And what's most surprising about this whole story is that the very qualities that made Chufa so valuable to ancient people have become a huge problem in modern industrial agriculture. A plant perfectly adapted to survival in the wild proved ill-suited to a system built on controlled fields and predictable harvests. The problem was never just that Chufa competes with other plants in the field. The real problem is that it clearly shows how fragile the modern industrial agricultural system can be. Most crops that today occupy millions of hectares of land require near-perfect conditions. They require fertile soil, regular fertilization, pest control, herbicide treatment, and sophisticated farm machinery. Vast fields of wheat, corn, and soybeans survive only through constant investment, control, and infrastructure, but tiger nut farming is completely different. It grows where many crops die, tolerates heat, withstands drought, and develops even in poor sandy soils. This is why agronomists often call yellow sedge one of the most resistant weeds in the world. Tiger nut yields are also impressive, as in Valencia, where it is grown for horchata, the yield of tubers typically ranges from 3 to 6 tons per acre. This is comparable to the yield of some grain crops grown with much more intensive use of fertilizers and chemical pesticides. And even in the wild, without care or soil cultivation, the plant is capable of producing hundreds of kilograms of nutritious tubers per hectare. However, it is precisely this independence that makes it inconvenient for the modern agro-industrial system. Chufa does not require annual seed purchases because the farmer can simply save some of the tubers and plant them again. It does not require large doses of fertilizers and can grow in soils that are considered unsuitable for many crops. Moreover, historically, it has been grown and harvested with minimal use of machinery, making it difficult to control for agriculture built on huge monocultures and strict field control. This is why in agronomic literature the main emphasis is not on its cultivation, but on methods of destruction. And this is exactly what truly sustainable agriculture should look like. A plant that grows on its own, survives drought, produces a stable harvest, and is stored for years without any loss. But as you might have already guessed, the modern agricultural system is structured completely differently. Farmers are taught to see such plants not as a resource, but as a problem that needs to be controlled. Any plant that grows without constant human intervention, without the purchase of seeds, without chemicals and technology, immediately becomes a threat to fields with commercial crops. And here, another question arises, which is rarely asked out loud. Who benefits from the fact that Chufa has been declared a weed? Of course, these are chemical companies that sell herbicides, seed corporations that annually sell new hybrid varieties, fertilizer producers, without which many modern crops simply do not yield a harvest, as well as agricultural machinery manufacturers. This entire vast system is built around crops that require constant investment, dependence, and control. And Chufa doesn't fit into this model at all. It cannot be patented because people have been growing it for thousands of years, and a farmer does not need to buy new seeds every year. It is enough to save some of the tubers and plant them again. It can grow in soils where many crops require large doses of fertilizers, and for an industrial system, this is a disaster. And that's why scientific recommendations often describe it not as an ancient food crop, but as a weed that needs to be eradicated. But despite this, the plant has not disappeared. And in Valencia, Spain, the cultivation of tiger nut has continued for many centuries. There is a special regulatory council that protects the tradition of producing horchata de Chufa and monitors the quality of the harvest, a tradition that has existed for more than 7 centuries. In West Africa, Chufa also remains part of everyday food, with the Hausa people growing it and selling it in markets in Nigeria, Niger, and Mali. The tubers are eaten raw as a sweet snack, fried or used in drinks, and are still part of everyday food today. Thus, knowledge of this plant has survived entire historical eras, colonialism, the industrialization of agriculture, and even the so-called Green Revolution of the 20th century. But it has never completely disappeared. And now, in another unexpected twist, Chufa has begun to appear again in a completely new place over the past decade: health food stores. Scientists have also paid attention again, and research shows that tiger nut can indeed be used to produce vegetable oil with a high oleic acid content, almost like olive oil. Other groups are studying tiger nut flour as a great gluten-free alternative to wheat. But something strange is happening. Despite all its properties, no major agricultural agency is promoting Chufa as a new staple crop for food security. Government programs to combat hunger and drought barely mention it, but agronomic bulletins still come out with recommendations on how to more effectively eradicate yellow sedge from fields. The infrastructure remains the same. The chemical industry continues to profit from the fight against this plant, and agricultural councils continue to consider it a problem. Meanwhile, the plant itself does the same thing it has been doing for thousands of years. It grows, forms tubers underground, survives drought, plowing, and even herbicides. And the most interesting thing about this whole story is that every time a person learns the truth, that a common weed was actually food from the Ice Age, part of the cuisine of ancient Egypt, and something that was placed in the tombs of the pharaohs, the situation becomes more difficult to control. Because at this point it becomes clear that the boundary between a weed and a crop is not determined by the nature of the plant, but by man. And what's most important is that every farmer who discovers this one day starts asking uncomfortable questions. Because sometimes Chufa produces more nutritious tubers per hectare than some traditional crops. Every field where tiger nut grows without fertilizer, without complex equipment, and without constant investment becomes living proof that the modern agricultural system is structured completely differently than we think. People have made a weed out of this superfood because they couldn't patent it. They simply created herbicides to make the problem go away forever because they couldn't commercialize Chufa. The modern world has convinced everyone that it is useless, simply because its value undermines their entire economic model. But as we already know, 16,000 years ago, everything was completely different, and this whole story was completely simple. Chufa simply fed people, steadily and reliably, without anyone's permission, and that's why they want you to forget about its existence. However, now you can no longer do this, because you know more than you would like to in the modern world. Chufa still grows on our soil and is still ready to give humanity everything that is hidden in its tubers.